Welcome back to The Price of Business. I'm your host, Kevin Price, talking to you about you and your business. My good friend Lee Kaplan, he's a regular feature on The Price of Business, bringing some really interesting insight and content of what's happening in the legal front. Love his insights, and he always keeps me on my toes. He's with Spicer, Kaplan, and Veselka, the law firm, and you can learn more about them at skv.com. Before we talk about our topics today, kind of give us an overview of what SKV is all about.
We generally handle civil litigation, occasionally white-collar criminal matters, but civil litigation ranging from plain old contract disputes, fraud claims, theft of trade secrets when people move from company to company, patent infringement cases. So we represent everybody from Fortune 10 companies to small business proprietors.
Yep, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about a couple of topics you brought up that I thought were fascinating. The first one was one that we heard about a week ago, is when we got wind that the administration was asking media to submit to bias surveys. And, wow, it's just a rather odd, and of course this follows stories of journalists, having their, emails, potentially tapped and all kinds of crazy things that we've never seen historically. What's up with that?
Well, I just thought it was boneheaded. And they're starting in Columbia. They proposed taking a survey to begin in Columbia, South Carolina. I'm not sure how they picked that, but of course, that's obviously a very Republican state. I don't know how many newspapers they have there, but in addition, the FCC normally regulates broadcast media, and they intended this survey to include print media. Everything about this is so boneheaded that it's breathtaking that somebody thinks that the government, in a time when we really have a proliferation of media, we have a blogosphere, we have more options on television, that they need to undertake some sort of bias investigation. After all, people may well be biased, but there are lots of opportunities. And we are back in a time where we don't have a limited number of networks. We may have some cities that don't have many newspapers, but anybody can put out, whatever kind of scandal sheet they may want to. So I just think this is an absurd idea, and for the government to be in this area is something that shocks me. They've cited some portion of the statute that they think gives them that opportunity, that is to look into the availability of news sources, but I think that's just, it's boneheaded, it's disgraceful. Other than that, I don't have any strong views about it.
You've said boneheaded 4 times so far. This must really be boneheaded.
I just can't imagine where anybody in the United States government thinks they should be looking at that. If anybody wants to go out and claim that a particular media outlet is biased, and the president does that regularly, talking about Fox News, and people on the conservative side do that regularly, talking about, say, the New York Times, that's fine. They're exercising their First Amendment rights. But to investigate bias in a formal way by the governmental agency, that is shocking.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Disgraceful.
It is. I agree with that entirely. And what's interesting about it is if people start getting a sense that certain media are being regulated or being controlled even a little bit, all that's going to do is force people more, it will move people more towards the rags that the FCC, I would think, would be even more alarmed about. Think about that.
Well, that's right. I mean, take a look at Venezuela. Who trusts the radio and television stations that the government controls or sponsors? Nobody does.
No one.
And this is allegedly a voluntary survey, but as we all know, whenever the government announces it's looking into something or investigating you, then you tend to mind your P's and Q's a lot more. And that's the last thing we need for a press in the United States.
About a decade ago, it seems, just to change the topic, and I agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more across the board on that topic. We don't always agree with each other, so that's great. And it's always good, but it's fun that we don't always agree, so it makes for entertaining radio. But let's talk a little bit. About a decade ago, I think, is when I first heard about the Ashby high-rise controversy. A decade ago. It has yet to be adjudicated. And now there's another lawsuit, and it's like, come on and adjudicate so other people have a sense whether or not we should even try a lawsuit. I think that would give people an idea or a clue. But here we have another lawsuit that's popped up. Talk about this.
Well, there's a new lawsuit that is, you might call it son of Ashby high-rise. There's a development planned between Kirby and San Felipe, between Kirby and Shepherd on San Felipe, which is to say right next to River Oaks. And this time, again, we have a fairly wealthy neighborhood that is objecting to a planned high-rise. The high-rise is planned by the Hines Group, which, is obviously a very reputable organization. Gerald Hines is a worldwide organization. And you have some residents that are upset about it. And I think this is a lawsuit that never would have been filed but for the fact that the Ashby high-rise lawsuit has continued and, by the way, is not over yet.
Right.
Although there was a verdict in that case which gave great heart to the plaintiffs, the residents in the area, so far the court has not entered a final judgment. I think there's a real question whether the court is going to impose any of the damages that were found for certain specific residents, whether the court will enjoin that development or issue some partial injunction, or whether any bit of that verdict will survive. Because the concept of nuisance is one that we're very acquainted with in the legal world. That is, if people take actions at their property that interfere with your enjoyment of your property, then the concept of nuisance allows them to take some action to get redress for that. But this is an extension of nuisance that is fairly new. And if we get out of the idea that a city, as a city, regulates development, but instead individuals can essentially shut off the building of a high-rise, that seems like an extension of the nuisance theory that we need to think hard about.
And the consequences would be far-reaching.
Well, it's NIMBY, not in my backyard, and everybody feels that way. And also the idea that only the wealthy can bring these lawsuits, or the well-organized neighborhoods can do this. We already have zoning, not zoning, but we have, in effect, zoning through restrictions that are allowed throughout the city. And obviously they're talking about
neighborhood-type restrictions.
Right.
Yeah.
People can develop an area and have restrictions. They can extend them, which has happened many times in neighborhoods and throughout Houston. But the Hines people are developing this property on an area in which there are no restrictions keeping them from
no zoning, no government zoning.
And Houstonians,
like Houston is used to.
We have rejected zoning multiple times. We have types of zoning, in effect, by various development rules that the city imposes. But if we allow this concept to proliferate, then there will never be a high-rise built in certain areas of Houston, despite the fact that there is no other legal restriction imposed on that.
Yep.
And if you think that Houston has to grow and we need more density to support, for example, mass transit, then we have a few individuals making policy for the entire city without a vote. And this is a common law concept that is nuisance, which they are essentially imposing on the whole city if they're able to do it. And I think we have to think hard about it. My views on it are fairly skeptical, but logically there's some appeal to the idea that, if somebody puts up a cattle rendering plant right next to you in an area where the noxious fumes come to your property and make it impossible for you to enjoy your property, well, that's a nuisance concept that probably a lot of people support. This is different. We're just talking about a high-rise. It'll create more traffic. It'll block out some of the sun, but that's part of what goes on in a city. And so whether nuisance should extend to that is very problematical for me.
It sounds like economic terror if you're in the construction industry. To have something that subjective and that arbitrary end up determining whether or not you can build.
And you'll never know unless essentially you put aside some huge amount of money and buy off every resident nearby, whether you'll be allowed to put up the high-rise. So you can go through all the planning, do all the work, buy the property, of course, and get started, and then suddenly somebody files a lawsuit and you spend several years in litigation, which is what happened to the Ashby high-rise people. They had abided by every rule, had all the permits, were hit with a lawsuit, and then the city more or less stepped in and for a while delayed that permitting process, and then the lawsuit went forward. But that lawsuit's not over yet, and I hesitate to predict what's going to happen. It's a very gifted judge who tried that case. I have to admit I was surprised it even went to a jury. but it did, and the judge now has the benefit of hearing all the lawyer arguments, all the evidence that anybody had to present, and he'll have a tough decision in that Ashby high-rise case. And I think that will set a precedent for these other lawsuits.
All right. Lee Kaplan is a regular feature on The Price of Business, law firm of Spicer, Kaplan, and Veselka. And you and I agreed 100%. How rare is that?
I'll try to fix that next time.
Oh, yeah, you will. You will. But you do a great job. I appreciate it. And I get great feedback from others about what you do. SKV.com. Lee Kaplan, very thoughtful contributor to this show. I do appreciate your good work.
Enjoyed it.
All right, when we come back, much more for you. I do want to remind you, best content here shows up over there at usdailyreview.com, and you're listening to The Price of Business.